Welcome and good morning. Okay, so this is, in fact, the U.S. to 1877, and thanks for the emojis. The crying. I can't understand any of these emojis at all. I hope that you guys can. Top of the morning to you. All right, so I want to talk today about the structures of empire, and we'll talk about the Toltecs, the Aztecs, Spanish settlement, Portuguese innovation with the plantation, and French settlement, which some professor of mine years ago referred to as fish, furs, and fanatics. And then very little bit about the English. Hello, conquistadors. Yes, the conquistadors get their day today. This is the day of the conquistadors. So we'll welcome. Well, as much as anyone could welcome the conquistadors. So I want to start by ask three big questions. How did the Spanish conquistadors succeed? Secondly, how do other Europeans scooch into this region? A couple of you asked that on Packback today, or in the last day or two. How did these other Europeans, the French and the English and the Spanish, French and the English and the Dutch, get into these regions when it's early dominated by Spain and Portugal? So how do other Europeans get in? Joint stock companies, right? The use of capital. And then how did the Portuguese plantation extract more from the land than the older Spanish conquistadors? Trade and furs, excellent. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So we'll start with the two seafaring empires. Stability and instability. It's hard to speak about for sure about whether there's stability or instability in England in this period. We've got the English Civil Wars. We've got the enclosure movement and stuff like that. But all of these places are going through dramatic changes in Europe, in part because there are dramatic changes going on in Europe, and in part because of the impact of this settlement. Okay, so we have two seafaring empires that get to the New World first, Spain and Portugal, and the Treaty of Tordesillas. So kind of the definition of hubris that defines Brazil as Portugal is controlling this region east of this line, and Spain is controlling the area west of this line. There's not very good mapping at this point, but this is hubris indeed. Why does the line actually does matter, though? This Treaty of Tordesillas, after this initial discovery, but nobody's quite identified where all the land boundaries are and things like that. Even today, that line is effectively the line between Spanish and Portuguese in South America. So the Treaty of Tordesillas actually does have this dramatic effect that continues all the way until today. Of course, it would irritate the people already there, as well as other Europeans who wanted to seize this land, but the line does matter. Okay, so from the Treaty of Tordesillas, we can say that 1500 to 1550 are the decades of Spain and Portugal. They take South America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. They're not going to keep it entirely, all of it, but that's really the 1500 to 1550 is the period of the conquistadors, the period in which Spain and Portugal are going to dominate. Now, why does Spain and Portugal dominate? We talked about this a little last time. Part of it is the Reconquista from 1100 to 1492. What's going to become Spain and Portugal are moving to retake Spain from the Hispanic Peninsula, from the Muslims. They do it partly through treaty and formal war, and partly through continuous guerrilla activity. Now, these are Muslim leaders in these regions, but they are not. This is not the Turkish Empire. The Turkish Empire is back further to the east. These are independent Muslim monarchs that are taken over by Spain and Portugal. Yeah, so they're wanting to push back the impact of not just the Ottomans, but what the Moors generally, people who are sort of Islamic folks. And this is as much a kind of political thing as it is a religious thing. Some of you asked why religion is so important initially in this settlement, why they're constantly forcibly converting natives, this has a lot to do with the Reconquista. A rough class of soldier settlers emerge, more like rancher raiders, who brave the borders and in exchange can do whatever they like in Muslim towns, including attack, rape, and plunder. The church does fund their missions. This is a kind of a latter-day version of the Crusades. The Crusades started in around 1000 AD, but this is still a kind of crusader mentality. They brave the borders. Their model so when we talk about Spain, but there is no Spain before 1491. There's the Kingdom of Castile and there's the Kingdom of Aragon, and the two of those kingdoms merge once they capture the Kingdom of Granada. So 1491 is the unification of Castile and Aragon. Castile is Isabella, Aragon is Ferdinand, and Ferdinand and Isabella create Spain basically when Castile and Aragon merge and they capture Granada and basically take back for Christians this whole peninsula that allows you to connect from the northern part of Europe to the southern part of Europe. The model for these crusader folks is this guy, El Cid, which is kind of ironic because he's a mercenary who fought both for Castile but also for the Muslim rulers of Zaragoza. So he was born in, where was he born? In Burgos. Let's see if we can find Burgos here. Go back. There it is. Burgos is in Castile. He's born in Burgos. He fights for Castile. Eventually, he gets the name El Cid, Al-Said, a Muslim name, the ruler or the lord. And he fights for both Castile and Aragon, but he becomes the model for he's alive around 1000 AD. Weird goals. Indeed, yeah. That is some kind of beard. This is entirely a mock-up. This thing that was made in the 17th or 18th century. This person was 700 years after El Said, so no one quite knew what he looked like. But yeah, that's El Said. And when all the Muslims are expelled from Seville or Granada, first they're expelled from, back to my map, from Seville, and then they're expelled from Granada in 1491. These soldier settlers emerge from the hills to seize the crowns of the Moors before them, and so we get kind of Christian sponsored, that is sponsored by the Catholic Church, raids on these regions, and this raiding kind of story is going to be crucial. Now, once that conversion happens, once the raid takes place, once the raping and pillaging is over, then there's a forced conversion that takes place, and this is the sort of justification for the Catholic Church's movement into these regions. There's a forced conversion of the Moors in Granada in 1491, pictured here. This is a painting is from the 1870s, but it captures, I think, at least the dress of the people who are there. And 1491 is, again, the union of Castile and Aragon when Ferdinand and Isabella get together. They march into Granada and they convert the Moors to Christianity. Where the Reconquista is basically taking place in this region. From it starts up, all the way up here around 1100, and it's around those 490 years or so, 390 years from 1100 to 1492, that they finally get to here, to Granada. So that's what they capture, and that's the sort of forced conversion. Spanish conquistadors will succeed. Good morning. In a mode that imposes a new kind of culture on top of an older one. And this is much the way that Rome, for example, did for the diversity of Greek civilization. When the Romans capture these Greek regions, the Greeks are much more civilized than them in some ways. They capture and absorb the culture of the Greeks. The Romans do in 208 BC. Likewise, the Catholic Church and the Spanish kind of capture and absorb in some ways in some ways arguably more civilized society, which is the society of the Islamic rulers in southern Spain. And this model of forced conversion is crucial for understanding the way in which they kind of justify these political invasions, justify killing, which is, of course, in the Bible not, particularly the New Testament, not sanctioned. Okay. So the Spanish, you have a group then of people like El Said who are accustomed to movement, the restructuring of society, attacking, and laying claim to the tribute from others. These conquistadors remove monarchs, replacing them with themselves. And that's precisely what Cortez is going to do when he gets to the New World in 1519. So let me back up a little bit. 1492 is the discovery of the of this continent, and there's a lot of movement around these islands. And but it's in 1519 that Hernando Cortez arrives. He lands at Veracruz, which is on the mainland of Mexico, with 600 soldiers. And Cortez assumes independent command in defiance of the governor of Cuba. The governor of Cuba was supposed to be the person who was supposed to invade the mainland. He doesn't do it. Cortez does it instead of him in 1519. And Cortez knows that he and his 600 men are going to be attacked by the governor of Cuba. And so in defiance of the governor of Cuba, they land and then they burn their boats behind them. It's basically success or death. That's it. Cortez orders the troops to burn the boats behind him, and thus begins the attempt to conquer the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Now, the place he's interested in is this, Tenochtitlan. It's been a capital for almost 200 years. It's larger than any city in Spain. Okay, the biggest city in Spain is probably Seville. Oh, the purpose of burning the boats is to say there's no going back. Either you're going to defeat the Aztecs with me, or you're not coming back, right? So it's a symbolic morale. There are a lot of entrepreneurs these days who say you need to be like Cortez and burn your boats. Basically, you have to be all in. And so this is Cortez's model of saying you're all in. You're going to burn your boats behind us and advance. You can argue it hurt morale. It's not clear. I don't think so, because I think the idea was that they believed that they were going to capture this golden city, which they had not seen in 1519, but they knew that there was this massive city, the head of the Aztec Empire, the center of the Aztec Empire, that was potentially theirs for the taking. It was either this way or death. Okay, this is the Aztec Empire. Now let's back up a little bit. No backseas. Okay. I'll take your word for it. I've not seen The Office, so but no backseas, right? There's no way of going back. Okay, so who are the Aztecs? Let me go back a little bit to say the Aztecs are an expanding empire themselves. The Aztecs are in some ways very much like Spain, which is expanding. So the Aztecs are. We need to start to talk about the Aztecs. We need to start with the Toltecs. The Toltecs are before them, and their capital city was Tulan, which is probably now the current city of Mexico. And it existed from 850 to 1150 AD, and was destroyed around 1150, possibly in a drought. After the Tula collapses, the descendants move south to an area around Lake Texcoco. Let me go back to this map here. So Tula is not here, but Tula is up around here, about 120 miles north of Mexico City, which is Tenochtitlan. Tula is there, it collapses, and people move to Lake Texcoco, rather, not Texcoco, Texcoco in this region. All right. The Mexica come from the western coast of Mexico. And the Mexica are warriors, very much like the conquistadors. They come from the western coast of Mexico in 1300, and they're driven away by the natives to the muddy edge of the lake of Texcoco. The Mexicas find an eagle on a cactus devouring a serpent, and this becomes... setting your car on fire. This becomes this symbol of the eagle on a cactus devouring a serpent becomes a symbol of these conquerors, who then call themselves the Aztecs. They are warriors, but perhaps their most important innovation is not war, it's actually surviving on this lake. How do they survive on a lake? Well, they create what are maybe arguably one of the most important innovations of the Aztecs, which is the chinampas, which are artificial islands designed to which appear to deal with the problem of drought. They basically create these artificial islands. There's no place to cultivate food. They've been driven to the edge of it. And it's easier if your city is a collection of islands connected by bridges. And these chinampas basically use human waste and animal waste to kind of build up these islands. The islands feed people, and then people move from island to island. So the current flag of Mexico, in fact, has that symbol of the eagle on a cactus devouring a serpent. So these chinampas basically allow the Aztecs not only to survive on Lake Texcoco, but also to thrive. So from around 1300 to around 1519, mostly, they're made of dirt, but they're covered with poop, yeah. In fact, some people have argued that this has a lot to do with a lot of the diseases that spread from the Europeans to bacteria and other, what are they called? That are spread from Europeans and animals that they bring with them, horses and dogs and things like that. They're spread onto these islands, and this is maybe what kills lots and lots of people, not just smallpox, but some of these other bacterial infections. But before then, human poop is not actually a bad way to supply crops, to feed crops. Lots of nitrogen and lots of other bacteria that are good for feeding crops. So between 1325 and 1519, so almost 200 years, Tenochtitlan goes from being a series of disconnected islands to being the biggest city perhaps in the world, between 200 and 400,000 people. All right, the biggest city in Spain is 35,000. Right, so it's something like 5 times to 10 times the size of the biggest city in Spain. All right, this is big. And this is what the Aztecs are. Okay. So, in 1428, we don't have a good history of the period before this, in part because history goes to the victors, right? And the Aztecs, Itzcoatl of the Aztecs and his chief minister and collect and burn all the hieroglyphic books with the history of this region. Okay? The history of the Toltecs, the history of the people before them. And the history is rewritten with Mexica at the center and viewing themselves as the heirs of the Toltecs. These Mexican warrior priests marry into the existing civilization, and it's an uneasy control. In 1519, Cortez arrives and he establishes somewhat peaceful relations with the city of Tenochtitlan. For 2 years. And in those 2 years, disease ravages the city, possibly through the poop islands, possibly through bacterial infection, also largely through smallpox. Am I going too fast? I'm sorry, I'll slow down. Who burned the books? Itzcoatl, Itzcoatl. This will be on YouTube when I'm done, so I apologize for going so fast. I will slow down a bit. Yeah. Sorry about that. I get so excited talking about Tenochtitlan, talking about the Aztecs, but I will slow down. Itzcoatl, Itzcoatl, burns down all the documents. Okay. Cortez establishes peaceful relations for the first 2 years, and in those 2 years, disease ravages the city. The conquistadors sort of rule the empire through Montezuma, who initially accepts them as a kind of mission. And then a larger force from Cuba arrives to arrest Cortez. 1519 is when he arrives. A larger force from Cuba arrives to arrest Cortez, but he convinces them to join him. During a festival, Spanish troops kill the Indians who are dancing, and the Aztecs begin to attack Cortez's army. The Spanish troops are expelled in 1520. So previously sort of guests of Montezuma, they try to control Montezuma, but around 1520, Montezuma is killed, almost certainly by the Spanish. They blame it on the Aztecs, but he's almost certainly the Aztecs, almost certainly the Spanish who kill Montezuma. And then we get the second phase. And the second phase is probably more important because the second phase, the Spanish retreat to a smaller city. I'm going to go back to my map here. The Spanish retreat to this city, Tlaxcala, and they're there for a couple of years. And in Tlaxcala, they recover, and there were new attacks by reducing lesser cities and getting allies. And it's at this point, the YouTube videos will have a transcript. They're automatically created a transcript on YouTube. Okay, I'm not sure I can answer that the question about the border. So so it's this area. Bear with me here for a second. This gray area. So this is Tenochtitlan. This is the nucleus of the empire. These are tributary regions around the empire, the yellow. The gray are the people who are not yet part of the this empire. Oh, I see. So the Camino de Honcho is basically their route to the Pacific Ocean. So they do control this road, basically a royal road that goes to the Pacific Ocean. So it's these other gray regions that are going to become crucial to Cortez's victory, because these gray regions, the Tarascos, the Tlaxcalas, Zapotecas, and the Mixtecas, help Cortez and basically join his army to then go back and take Tenochtitlan in 1521. Crucial to this retaking of Tenochtitlan is this woman called Malinche, Malinche, Malinche. She was a daughter, originally probably her name was Malinal, of an Aztec cacique or boss who was sold into slavery by her mother when her father died. So her father dies, her mother sells her into slavery, but she was well educated. She comes from an Aztec family. She spoke Nahuatl, which is the language of the court, but she also spoke Yucatec. Yucatec. What's Malinche? Oh, thank you. Malinche. Malinche. Sorry, I'll try to go a little more slowly. I should have put her name on the thing. I'm one of these people who hates text on PowerPoint because I feel like text on PowerPoint, I don't want to read the text to you, but I should do that for names. Nahuatl. Oh, Nahuatl. Thank you. Nahuatl. So well educated. She spoke Nahuatl and Yucatec, which one of Cortez's men knew. So she translated from Nahuatl to Yucatec, and then eventually she learns Castilian, which is what Cortez speaks. And so she serves as Cortez's translator and mistress. And she bears a child with him. She's viewed in Mexico as a fairly she's viewed as a kind of a sellout. But not surprisingly, she favored the gray regions where she was basically brought up. She was born in probably in somewhere in Tenochtitlan, but she was raised in these gray regions and probably saw her allegiances more with the people who hated the Aztecs than the Aztecs themselves. And this is back to this question that a couple of you asked, is why is it that these people side with the Spanish? And the answer is that there are all these sort of micro patriotisms, that's what historians call it, micro-patriotism, where people kind of commit to their town or their local community, and they don't much like the larger empires around them. Cortez is able to leverage this largely through Malinche. So Malinche translates for Cortez. Yeah. I will post the lecture notes, the slides on ELC when I'm done. Okay. I won't have a transcript. The transcript, I'm afraid you'll have to rely on YouTube for that. Okay. Because my notes, if you were to read them, will not make any sense. I could give you my notes, but they're basically, be sure to mention the mistress. Be sure to mention, so they won't make a whole lot of sense to you. I apologize for that. So this is the Spanish siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521. And this is the kind of the height of conquistador defeat. What benefit? How do they win? Number one is disease, probably smallpox, but probably also lots of other bacterial infections and things like that strike in part because these Spanish, not knowing it, are bringing animals that are new to these regions. The animals have zoonotic diseases that most Spanish people aren't susceptible to, but the people who are in these regions are susceptible to these diseases. So that's number one, is disease. Number two is the psychological advantage. If you look here, you've got full body armor. They also had horses. The horses were shocking to the Aztecs. In many cases, when there are battles, there were few, pitched battles or stage battles where the Aztecs would challenge the horses to war. They didn't understand. They recognized that the animals were kind of fighting, but they saw them as kind of warriors or something like that. The dogs are probably also really important. When warriors were captured by Cortez's troops, the warriors would be cut up and fed to Cortez's dogs. So these dogs were massive. They were terrifying. And quite unlike anything that the Aztecs had seen before. They'd seen jaguars, they'd seen these other animals, but not domesticated animals that could tear a person limb from limb, that could eat up the sort of body of others. So that's number two, is the psychological advantage. Full body armor, horses, guns, and dogs. The guns were not really that useful for killing people, but they provided an element of surprise. People found it shocking that these things that looked like bows or something, big rods, could fire. There were ships that were, as you can see here, the ships weren't so important as so much as the cannon that were mounted on these little basically rafts. They weren't galleons as they're depicted here, but basically rafts. And there were basically artillery that were firing into the center of the city. Third was the Allies, and this is perhaps most important. The military support from the tribes and communities and micro regions all around Tenochtitlan. For the Mexican Indians resented Aztec power and demand for sacrificial victims. Okay, if we want to understand the Allies, we want to understand why the Allies sided with with Cortez against them, we need to think about the sacrificial victims. And this is key to Aztec power. The sacrificial victims were part of the ritual of Xipe Topec. It's on the syllabus, the YouTube name. There's a link. It's very long name in YouTube, but if you go to the syllabus on ELC, click on ELC, go to ELC, click on Overview. There's a link there to the syllabus, to the YouTube channel. The sacrificial victims were part of the ritual of Xipe Topec, and this is our Lord of the Flayed One. Crucial to Aztec rule over the Toltecs and the other folks around them, priests and others would capture a warrior, cut out his beating heart of a chosen victim, then peel off their skin and drape their bodies with it. Then using obsidian blades, which were developed by the Aztecs, which are 800 times sharper than a razor, 3 times sharper than a diamond. These obsidian blades would bore holes into their skulls. And some scholars have argued that these ritual sacrifices, and then the skulls would be lined up. The skulls of all the defeated warriors, of the sacrificial victims who would be given by these communities. Among the things that they had to pay was not just food, not just jaguar pelts, not just headdresses and costumes and things like that, but they also had to provide young men sometimes young girls, who would be killed in this ritual way. And some scholars have argued that these ritual sacrifices prevented wars between communities by basically terrorizing them. But what the Aztec rule was seen by many people around them as brutal and horrible, and this, in part, helps explain why Cortez is successful at getting them to support. The fourth thing is pigs. Pigs are crucial to understanding Cortez's victory. At least one breeding pair of pigs was placed in islands all along the Caribbean. And pigs were smarter than dogs, goats, horses, or cows. They could eat almost anything on islands, including bird eggs, snakes, acorns. The pigs fill up all the islands around the Caribbean, and they provide a food source for Spaniards who just grab them and cook them. And so these pigs, even when they're in a region where they don't have the support of native people, those native people won't provide any food, the Spaniards still have dried and smoked pig as a kind of backup food for themselves, and that's crucial. You can't really invade with 500 warriors. Well, there was like 800 warriors or so, Spanish warriors, 1,000 other troops. You can't invade a city of 200 to 400,000 people without backup food, and this pigs were crucial to this. Yes, army rolls on its stomach. Okay, the result of this is going to be basically, bear with me here for a second, the encomienda system. The encomienda system is basically where a labor tribute is demanded. This is the encomendero, the person who demands tribute. This is the labor that's provided by the regions. And so basically they take over the Aztec Empire. They take over this requirement of goods, and rather than requiring jaguar skins and costumes and young boys or girls or warriors, they demand food and silver and gold and these other things. It asserted that Indians were the subjects of the crown, but that Spanish conquerors on the ground could get tribute from the Indians in the region. So that's the encomienda system. The encomendero is on the left, and it's suited in a way to a medieval form of conquest. The focus was on the duty of those subjugated, not on the ownership of the land. So the Spanish weren't especially interested in controlling the land. They were mostly concerned about controlling the tribute, controlling the labor that was demanded in these regions. And so the Spaniards sort of decapitate the Aztecs, right? They they eliminate Montezuma, they, to a certain extent, intermarry with some of the Aztec leaders, and they basically place themselves at the center of this already formed, already coherent empire and expand it. So that's how the Spanish succeed, is that they rely on a hierarchical system that's somewhat unpopular, and they replace themselves. Effectively, it's decapitation. There are a few new techniques. They just sort of establish themselves as Aztec monarchs. Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire is very similar. And this is going to take place a little bit later in the 1530s or so. And the Inca Empire is very different, though, from the Aztec Empire. The Inca Empire is around Peru. No, we're in chapter 2, I think. Actually, we're in the, where are we? We're between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Some of this stuff is in chapter 3, so I apologize, but this is just sort of my order for doing it. Pizarro, conquest of the Inca Empire is similar. The Inca Empire is very different. The Aztecs have pictographic writing. The Incas only have knotted string, which are basically used as a census. The Aztecs used north, south, east, and west. What we would call, basically the four directions of the compass. The Incas had a kind of radial system for delivery, which was much more precise. So sort of degrees back and forth. Yes, the backpack postings start today. Yeah, questions ideally done before class. If you get it done after, that's fine. 2 answers by Thursday, but questions today on Tuesday. Okay. Labor problems. Okay, so this is the Inca Empire. Inca Empire is very different. The Inca Empire is built on roads. So there is one road in the Aztec Empire. The Inca Empire is much longer. It depends on Calpacñan, which are is the Great Road in the Quechua language. These roads are still exist. You should have gotten the Packback link by email. If you're relatively new in the class, it should come from packback.co, and I've sent them multiple times to folks. But if you're new in the class, you might need to contact your TA to ask them to get you signed up for Packback. Look again at the syllabus, and it'll have the contact your TA, and your TA will make sure you get an invitation to Packback. But it has to come from them to make sure that you're in the right groups. Yeah, it might be in spam. Search for packback.co. Okay. So this is the conquest of the Inca Empire. These are the roads of the Inca Empire. It's about 10,000 miles of roads, believe it or not. These roads are narrow because there were no wheeled vehicles. Llamas were basically used to carry things along this road. And that you can see in the center here, one of the ancient Inca roads. Inca roads. And so basically what Pizarro does is he travels along these roads, basically capturing people. It's difficult to, it's just barely possible for horses to travel along these roads. Horses travel along these llama roads. There are, this Inca Empire defends on potatoes. At its center, potatoes were mostly what the Inca folks feed themselves with. People in the Inca Empire feed themselves with. There's fish and cocoa and other goods that travel along these regions. Okay, so the problem with this encomienda system that's established both in the Aztec and the Inca Empire is that it doesn't draw much labor. It doesn't actually provide that much in the way of benefits or for the empires that establish themselves. When the Europeans, particularly the Spaniards, want more, they can't get it. And in Brazil and in the northern colonies, in the Spanish Empire, in the islands, when they want more, they can't get it. In Brazil and these other countries, Native Americans just move further west. They just escape. They just leave. So if they become too brutal in their demands, then people escape, and lots of people escape and leave the Spaniards behind. A further problem for the Spanish Empire is the constant attacks by European nations. They can sort of scooch in and steal some trade like the Dutch do in Venezuela. And this is where those islands are very important, because the islands are places that aren't very easy to control, relatively easy to control. And so French settlers, for example, and some English settlers settle in Cuba and Hispaniola and places like this. And they use the pigs themselves to feed themselves. In fact, the word buccaneer is a term that's initially refers to the French folks who settle on Hispaniola, take the pigs and cook them into boucans and then sell them to ships that are passing by. And so basically, even though the Spanish claim, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, to control this massive area, they can't control it. And so this, the boucan is a term derived from the smoked meat of pigs that French castaways sold to passing ships. The focus then is, how is this wealth extracted? The focus for the Dutch, the English, the French and others is, how is this wealth established? And that is from the Spanish Main, which is the mainland here around Spain, that Spain controls. This is the Spanish Main in this area around here. And it's La Carrera de Indias from 1500s forward, which is the shipping back of the gold and silver from these places where it's dug up in the mines, in the encomienda system, and sent back to Spain. These galleons are shipped back, and many British, French, and Dutch settlers and countries raid these galleons, attack them, and steal the gold and silver, sink the ships. So this is the problem, is that there's a sort of decapitation of these empires, but it doesn't provide all the wealth that they hope it can. And once that wealth starts to flow back over this very narrow corridor, then the Dutch and the French and the English take advantage. Okay, a little bit more about Spanish settlement. Another thing about Spanish settlement that you see is what we call syncretism, basically a joining of Catholic traditions, Roman Catholic religious traditions with existing indigenous traditions. And we're going to see a lot of this in the American South, in the U.S., where also as African traditions are absorbed into what we call U.S. Christianity, American Christianity. Likewise, in the Catholic faith, what Catholic Franciscans and Dominicans and others do is take existing indigenous traditions, local traditions, and turn them into Spanish traditions. Syncretism, there we are. Okay. Does that work? You guys can see the chat. That's how you spell it. Maybe I'll do that. If people ask me for spellings of things, I'll do it. I'll spell it in the chat. Excellent. I will do that. Another great thing about Twitch. Okay. So in Peru and Mexico, we see a grafting of Spanish settlement over the labor processes that already exist, labor practices and reciprocal obligations. But we also see that in religion. So, if Indians in or Native people in Mexico worship a palm tree in a particular area, then Spaniards will nail across a piece of bark sideways on the palm tree and call it a cross, right? And Franciscans will cover up a sacred meeting spot and put a church on it. So I'll go back to here to Tula. Tula is this ancient city that was long destroyed around 1135, which is the Toltec capital. And as soon as the Spaniards arrived, they established the biggest monastery in the New World on the site of Tula. Likewise, they do the same thing with Tenochtitlan. They level Tenochtitlan. They destroy the city. They absolutely wipe it out. And then they rebuild on top of it these new traditions, which are kind of merged with local traditions. And one example of that we still see today is the Day of the Dead. The Day of the Dead was actually the month of the dead in a sort of Aztec tradition, when the spirits of the dead would supposedly come back to visit the living in what was the Aztec calendar is different. Basically, the end of October, they would visit, and you would first invite the children into the family, back into the family, the dead children, and then dead ancestors back the next day. And this ceremony is basically taken over and turned into Catholic traditions in Mexico. So even today, this very ancient, probably indigenous tradition is turned into a modern tradition. And that's called syncretism, where you blend a local tradition with a new tradition. This cultural interacting is a grafting. Spanish invaders practice what anthropologists call zones of inclusion, where they bring in one tradition and meld it with another. So few women were brought to the colonies originally in Spanish settlement, and there's considerable intermarriage between Spanish men and native women. The term for this is mestizos. I'll spell that again. M-E-S-T-I-Z-O-S. Mestizos. I'm getting ahead of myself, but as African slaves are brought in as slaves are brought in from Africa to work on plantations, intermarriage takes place there as well. Okay. So this whole area by the Caribbean, if you've ever, you're probably familiar with the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, and with, I don't know, God knows, the computer games where you're fighting against Cuba and Spain and others. There's a meeting place not just of the variety of cultures in the Americas, but also a kind of warfare between the Spanish, the French, and the Mexican empires. The reason the Caribbean is so important is because of this, because this is the base where the gold and silver is going to be shipped back. It's a tremendous amount of wealth that's gained from here. So somebody asked, why is it that this settlement of these regions and these sort of discussion of the tragedy of the Indians and others, why isn't there more of that? And there is a little bit more of that. A little bit of complaints about the tremendous die-off of native peoples, not just in because of disease, but also because of sort of murder, because of conquest and other things like that. And Bartolomé de las Casas is he's called the defender of the Indians. He's one of these people who protects, and his story of the kind of rape of the Indies is published in Portuguese and Spanish, and then translated into English very quickly. And the English then used de las Casas's expose, his basically description, firsthand account of the kind of horrible ways in which natives were treated, as an explanation for why the English will be better. Ah, thank you. Will be better at this. It's not. It should be visible on the bottom of the screen there, but yeah, Bartolomé de las Casas. So, what Las Casas answer, and there's a secret behind Las Casas that's not well known. Las Casas is a slaveholder. Las Casas is a slaveholder, and his solution to the problem of the Indies is to bring Africans to replace native people, so that this sort of empire can continue. So the English translations, the Dutch translations of this from Spanish by Las Casas, it turns into a kind of story of that's called the Black Legend. And the Black Legend is this story about, all the horrible things that Spain does. The British and the French and the Dutch are later going to use this Black Legend to sort of justify their expansion into this region. But let me talk a little bit about African slavery. So Las Casas says we can't brutalize these native people, these Indian people. His solution, weirdly, is to brutalize African people, to bring them to this new world and have them be this sort of labor force. He says basically the justification for this is that the people in the Indies can be converted, but that Africans can't be converted, and so it relies on the Portuguese system. And I mostly talked about Spain, but Spain and Portugal come at the same time. The Portuguese method of expansion into this new world is very different. And it's the Portuguese method that's going to be adopted by people in the American South, by the Dutch, by the English, by the French, when they create the sort of systems of slavery, African slavery, in the New World. Okay, so to do that, we have to get back off the Americas and move all the way back to the west coast of Africa. And this little island, or these two joined islands, Sao Tome and Principe, and I apologize, I don't have the accent marks, but that's the place, Sao Tome and Principe. And Sao Tome and Principe, this is they start importing African slaves to the Americas around 1500, but they do it first. The first use of African slaves is actually in Sao Tome and Principe in 1498. Okay, around that time, right around 1498 to 1500, they start buying enslaved people from the west coast of Africa and then bringing them to this island to have them produce sugar. Okay, so at the same time, or actually before, Las Casas is invading the Aztecs, and at the same time that that Pizarro is invading the Incas, the Portuguese have a different solution. And the solution starts here by putting African people on islands and having them produce sugars. No, they're not for processing slaves. They're for producing sugar. And the technology for producing sugar is a complicated one. I'm going to talk more about sugar in the next couple of days. But basically, what you do is you take sugar cane, you grind it up, you boil it, you grind it up and boil it again, you grind it up and boil it a third time. Finally, you produce something that's dry, that you can dry and produces sugar. There's all this other leftover stuff, which is turned into rum and other goods, molasses. That whole technical process is borrowed from Islamic enslavers in the Caribbean, but Portugal does it. And so what's the advantage of an island? No, this sugar is produced not in the Caribbean, but sugar is produced on the west coast of Africa. This is 200 miles west of the coast of Africa. And this is where sugar is initially produced by Portugal. It's very close. If we had a map, right, we could go around the coast here and up to Portugal. So it's relatively close, but it's only 200 miles from these trading posts that the Portuguese have established all along the west coast, all along the south. Among the things that can be traded, that the Portuguese trade, are silver, beads, knives, guns, other things. And among the things that they take, besides ironwork, which Africa has amazing ironworks, are enslaved people. And these enslaved people are placed on the island. As you can imagine, the island is a perfect place for producing. And you'll notice here that Sao Tome and Principe is right on the equator, because you need to be very close to the equator, relatively close to the equator, to produce sugar in this period. And this African island is going to be the model for sugar trading in the Caribbean. This is sugar making in Hispaniola in the Caribbean in the 1550s. And it's basically a letterpress copy of what the Portuguese do in 1500, around 1500, off the coast of West Africa. It's just that the island is further away from Africa than Sao Tome and Principe. This is going to be the way that the Portuguese are going to be much more effective at producing wealth from these regions. Sugar, as we'll discuss in a couple of days, is much more is valuable as a preservative for food, and that makes it very, very valuable. So it's not just because you like to have your chai tea latte or something like that. It's also because sugar is a food preservative, and it allows many more people to survive if you can preserve food over longer periods. So the Portuguese solution is to use imported Africans who cannot move, right? And that's why the islands initially. They can't escape and support themselves on foreign plants because they're stuck on a little island, right? Mass labor is going to be used in specialized agricultural production for export. Laborers as a commodity are going to be used up and replaced by purchase. The horrible thing about this is that there's a heavy male bias in this system. Lots of men are going to be brought to this island. They're going to produce the sugar until they die and be replaced by others. It's a system to supply large numbers annually, and there has to be a back and forth trade. And so from east to west, that trade is in enslaved people. And from west to east, that trade is in sugar. The triangular trade is going to be later, but it's basically a back and forth system of bringing enslaved people over to do the work, bringing people back. And this relies not just on force, although it absolutely relies on force. It also relies on hunger, right? If you're on an island and you cannot support yourself, you cannot escape and support yourself, you're obliged to do this work. There's a debasement in custom. The people here are considered unworthy of acculturation by the Portuguese. And there's a linkage of status with color, so that people's color becomes the thing that defines them. And so this is what the Portuguese bring to the New World. When De las Casas writes, a little bit later, he says, we need to use this Portuguese system in the Americas because this Portuguese system of using enslaved laborers is better than the widespread murder of people in the Indies. So it's a very peculiar argument, this black legend. It's a peculiar argument, but it becomes ultimately useless. Spain does create sugar colonies, particularly in Cuba later. This is the new model for settlement. And this is how we get African slavery in the New World. It starts actually in Africa itself, right off the coast, and then the Portuguese bring it all the way to the New World. The French also try plantations. The French start in Tortuga. Let's see if I can find Tortuga. Bear with me here. No, it's too small an island, I think. No, it's not there. Spanish for turtle. In 1665, and Jamaica also becomes these colonies. But early on, from 1500 to 1550, we're talking about decapitating empires. After around 1550, we start to see a new model. No longer the encomienda system, no longer the sort of labor demands on the Indies. Increasingly, this very complicated system of enslaving people people being enslaved in Africa, brought over to the New World, and used to produce sugar. Societies are built around the export of goods to the Old World. It's horrifyingly brutal, but in some ways more. This system that exists in Hispaniola and the islands, the technology is actually more advanced than in most European cities. These are really kind of factories in the field. The Portuguese and the French colonies in some ways solve the problem that the Spanish cannot. They crack the nut of labor relations by basically destroying local communities in Africa and rebuilding them along a model of gang labor. It is still a somewhat syncretic process economically. There's still a kind of combining of practices, Africans, labor, bound together in these communities, but one in which people are separated from others, in which the Portuguese intentionally bring people from different parts of Africa so that they cannot share the same language. They separate themselves from the people whose work will provide the surplus. So unlike the Spanish system where you kind of intermarry with this community, you create this sort of separate community that's going to provide the labor and do not intermarry with those. And that becomes something like the Portuguese system. This is called the plantation. Sometimes you need to keep up with me. Sorry, I'm just noticing this. Sometimes it's a chapter ahead, sometimes it's a chapter behind. I'm going to be all over the place. And that's basically when we tell this story, all these things are happening at multiple times. You don't need to care about the dates. But the fact that these things are all happening simultaneously means I tend to move a little bit more in terms of time through this book, but the book tends to move more in terms of communities. And so there's a section on African slavery. There's a section on the Caribbean communities and things like that. So I'm more or less moving through time, and they have their very different method. As you'll see in the chapter outlines, the dates overlap in a lot of the chapters. Okay. So this is the model. Let me talk a little bit about New France, because much of the territory that we think about, under the same rule, following this War of Succession, before again breaking up. The Aragon and Castile and ultimately Grenada are going to be formed to produce what we call Spain. But yes, the pop quizzes will just be based on our assigned weekly readings. That's right. Okay. A little bit about northern French colonies before we go to questions. So France in the same period, right around the same period, from 1500 to 1550, France is moving in, and it's moving in from the north. Why? Because France and Britain are relying increasingly on fish that are in the region that we would now call Greenland and Iceland and places like this. So they're moving in, they're establishing fisheries. The fisheries are supporting navies. The navies are gradually expanding further and further west through Newfoundland and down the St. Lawrence River. So much of what we call the United States now is French controlled in the 16th and 17th century. Or if there's a single empire that can control it, it's obviously controlled by native empires, lots and lots of them. But the French are the most visibly active European state in this region. I sort of misspoke. They begin with fishing along the St. Lawrence River. Salted and smoked cod are incredibly valuable in Western Europe. Why? Again, because food. Because there's still famine in Europe. Because there's still... and so salted and smoked cod become incredibly valuable. Yeah, that's so. The Portuguese in general did not intermarry, but just took slaves after they dismantled a group of people. Eventually, this is not to say that there aren't, biracial people in Portugal. There are biracial people in the American South, but it's much less a kind of mestizo society in Portugal, in part because of African slaves that are being brought in these regions. They gradually move into fur trapping, beaver primarily, which provides lining for coats and hats in France. Some of this is acquired through trade with the Indians, and others acquired by trapping. Catholic communities settle in these regions, and this is where we get the fanatics. I forget which professor told me that it's fish, furs, and fanatics to remember the French, but is what local governors would have called French missionaries. Priests remain a thorn in the side of the empire, particularly in the French Empire. The extent to which we know about native traditions, a lot of the native traditions that we know about from this period rely on a particular group of narratives created by the Jesuits called the Jesuit Relations in English, or I'll butcher. I'm not going to butcher the French here, where they describe in detail what these are happening in these native communities. Really, the best account that we have as historians of these native communities is really from the Jesuits, because they did a tremendous job of trying to learn the languages and others. They took meticulous notes who wanted to learn about the societies that were being pushed aside in this settlement. As with the Spanish colonies, there is some intermarriage with native people. The term for these in French is Métis. Métis. Yeah, we don't have many native voices for this period, and so we're ultimately relying. And so I think the most descriptive sections in chapter 2 that we have are really the Jesuit sections, because the Jesuits spent a lot of time documenting these communities. The other stuff that we have is really just incidental, and we're really just sort of piecing together with very little information this. The French religion is also syncretic. The French religion is also, people worship a sort of person or a lake or something like that, and the Jesuits will turn it into a Christian tradition. This is very much, this is how Roman Catholicism works for thousands of years, right? Easter is not a Christian tradition. It's an old European, probably Celtic tradition that we have no idea who Yoster is, the former, but we get Easter in part because there's this older tradition that's a Celtic tradition that's borrowed and then reappropriated by the Catholic Church. Likewise, Christmas and the Christmas tree and all those other sorts of things is not just the birth of Christ, but it's also the tree itself is a symbol that goes back to ancient Celtic traditions. Likewise, the French in New France take existing traditions and meld them with Catholic traditions to convert people. Okay, to conclude before we get to questions, how did the Spanish conquistadors succeed? They succeed by decapitating complex hierarchical societies like the Aztecs and the Incas in the 15 teens to the 1530s. The tragedy, of course, is that Spanish religious leaders destroyed the text, just like the Aztecs destroyed the texts that contradicted the version that they were the founders of the Toltec Empire. Likewise, the Catholic priests burned all the records, or almost all the records, of the Aztec Empire. They did not keep, or we still don't fully understand the stringed, the knotted kepu, I think they're called, writing system of the Incas. We still don't fully understand the Aztec hieroglyphic language even after all these years, in large part because the previous historical records are destroyed. So they decapitate complex hierarchical societies and appropriate their goods. The most valuable things are not actually in the long term gold and silver It's things that the Spanish don't initially take into account, like cocoa, like the potato, like these other goods of the New World that are going to feed millions of Europeans. How did the other Europeans scooch in? Initially by providing trade goods. This is like the buccaneers who provide bucan, the smoked meat, and then raiding, pirates on the Spanish Main, English, French, and Dutch. Then finding other goods that are needed in Europe. This would be sugar, but also fish and furs, and shipping them back. The Portuguese plantation becomes the model for this after Spain effectively loots most of the Aztec and Inca Empire. What's left over is this Portuguese plantation system, in which societies in Central and Southern Africa are broken up by Europeans, but also to a certain extent by Africans themselves, transported initially to islands on the coast of Africa. It's mostly guns that allow the destruction of Central and Southern Africa. They're transported to islands on the coast of Africa and then later transplanted this entire system onto Brazil. The Portuguese model will become widely adopted in the US.